Good afternoon, everyone. This is your 2020 to 2030 global cooling forecast. The crossover line to the cooling, summer of 2019. Full cooling will begin in the winter of 2019 and 20. We're going to take a look at some Landscheidt cycles here. The yellow squares is where it matches exactly with what's going to occur in the next few years. Landscheidt uses the gas giants in certain configurations to predict solar cycles and effects here on Earth. Notice the configuration of the gas giants in the pairs. You have a lead pair and a following pair. This is the setup for 2024, Uranus, Jupiter leading, Neptune, Saturn following. And then 2034, 10 years after the cycle follows, Saturn and Jupiter swap places. Back to 1665, you'll see the same configuration going forward with the following lead year. And 10 years later, you see how the planets are still in the configuration trailing. 1845, same configuration, almost nearly identical to what we're experiencing in 2023. 1855 matches exactly. Going back to 1st century BC, we see it again. Forward trailing year, 10 years after following. Different way to take a look at the cycles, all three matching. All the northern hemisphere ocean indicators are turning cool during all of these events, which we are going to mimic again. Everywhere you see a down-pointed needle is where the temperature dropped on these orbital giant alignments. Global sea temperatures dropping during the last events, decreasing fish yields globally. World wheat production, 127 million ton loss by 2021-2022. Anything 45 north is going to go offline. Global famine during the 1600s, you saw the solar diagrams before, 25% loss of global population. 1845-55, 10% loss of global population. These two videos explain the mechanized chaos economically. That's an orchestrated decline. I highly suggest watching these two. We've got 40 trillion in derivatives that are going to be purposefully unwound to lock up your money so nobody can travel. Capital controls. And if you do have some gold and silver on hand and an automobile, you're not going to be able to travel even within your own country. This is the plan for the United States. Red area is a no-go. It's a purposeful divide and conquer, so nobody will trust anybody. And this is the end game. All of the disconnected stories in the news of government erosion of rights, mass ammunition purchases, refurbishment of military bases for internment facilities, gross financial mismanagement globally through all the central banks and continents, militarization of many countries across the planet. Now all these dots can be connected together. Before they were just individual idea thoughts, but they were never connected before. Now we can connect it. There will not be enough food to feed our global population by 2023 and 2024. Governments are going to actually try to control this inevitable social collapse and upheaval because of global famine. Now this answers why all of the purposeful, coordinated chaos is going on around the planet, because there's so many people waking up asking, why is this happening? How can sane people be in charge of this? Here's all your answers. The crossover line for the initial cooling should start right around the spring of 2019. The actual cooling for the winter will begin, and you'll see snow as early in September, maybe even the last weeks of August when this starts to roll around, and cooling will actually begin at that point. I wanted to introduce you to Landscheidt Cycles. This is how a lot of forecasts are coming forth, including mine. You want to divide the solar system into different quadrants. Now this is a classic Landscheidt setup here of the gas giants. Saturn at the very bottom, and then Uranus, Neptune, and Jupiter across the top there. Now what you'll also notice is all the four gas giants clump up somewhere in a run up to these events. Quadrant 1, you'll see back around the 11th century BC. This is where the quadrant 2 configuration would begin, around 10th century AD. Quadrant 3, 3rd century. Quadrant 4, right around the 11th century AD. Landscheidt broke these down into magnetic effects on each other through gravity and magnetism because of these gas giants. Now, the lineups you see right here have very little effect. They have sort of a wave canceling effect on each other. But when we come to this particular orbital lineup, this seems to have an intensity and amplification effect. And there's going to be two major types of events, A and B. The AMP is angular momentum perturbations. If Saturn's lining up over on, shall we say, the west quadrant bottom, it'll have a negative 30-degree radius somewhere in there. Is going to have a significant effect as well. You'll get a different kind of camel hump coming over to sort of the eastern bottom quadrant at 30 degrees or so plus. It breaks down further into these 8 configurations, either type B, which is not so strong, or type A, which has significant effects on our Earth. So you can map this out over time. This goes all the way back to about the first year AD. I wanted to start around 10th century or so to speed things up. Let's start on the first line. Second camel hump in there with the red arrow, right around 987. What you can see is the planets lighting up in quadrant 2, and then on the second rotation around, they spread out into the leading pair and the following pair. So if these orbital variations are really on a measurable pattern, we should see the same thing again. So let's go down to the second line. Between 1040 and 1080 AD, again, we get that configuration where the 4 gas giants are together. And then after 10 years, the second rotation, they split into that leading and following pair again, exactly like we saw before. Interestingly, though, in that late 1100s is the collapse of the Jin dynasty as well as the Mongol invasions. They don't expend energy and resources invading other areas unless it's out of necessity. There was not enough food, it was too cold, they could not survive, so the Mongols had to invade. Jump down to the third row, second camel hump in, right around 1320. We'll see this different type of configuration where the gas giants are already into the leading and following pairs, sort of in a semi-rectangular formation. And then on the second rotation around, they've split quite a bit into the northern and southern, shall we say, quadrants of the solar system split in two. When we look at this 1300s, the way the configuration splits out here, significant drop of almost 2 degrees Celsius temperature, which ushered in the Wolf minimum and the full collapse of the Yuan dynasty. Interesting about this one, there's a lot of information in Chinese history. Famine, droughts, floods, plagues, societal upheaval, bye-bye emperor. Take you to the bottom row so we can see another matchup here. Around 1500, we get that same leading pair and the following pair in the first initial pass, and then you get that same spread in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, if you will, of the solar system on that second pass, the 10th year. And you can go forward and back in time. Whenever you see the camel hump, that is a significant cooling event. As you go through time, you'll start to see areas where there were no cooling events for 80 to 100 years, which brings me to the Gleissberg Cycles. Now, the Gleissberg cycle, also 80 to 100 year event, layering on top of the Landscheidt Cycles. This shows the change in solar rotation at deeper levels of the sun with the convection to the surface, which has a corresponding effect on our Earth due to luminosity and irradiance. Literally how much watts per square meter of energy is striking the surface of our planet can be affected in this cycle. A little bit better graphic for you here to visualize and see the long-term cycles. Now that blue wave is where we are going on the downward trend currently, and it should bottom out around 2030. Taking a look here further back in time and forward in time through the forecast, this is just a spot line graph that shows the same information. Around 2030 is where we will bottom out after the cold. Now the gas giants I keep referring to are Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, and Jupiter. Now remember, their orbits are not exactly the same every year, year after year. Sometimes they're a little closer to the sun, sometimes they're a little further away from the sun. Orbital velocity does change on these things. Jupiter seems to be the driver on it. Now add into all of this the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. It's a spin-orbit coupling. Now, when these two orbits, as they did in the late 1600s, I've highlighted each area with the yellow box so you can see where I'm talking about. When these two orbits being the closest to the sun, we get the effect of a cooling. So you'll see the cooling exactly in the 1640s, 1840s, right here, right now, and again it'll happen around 2200. So let me bring you back to these angular momentum graphs. I highlighted in the yellow boxes specifically where the coolings are. Take a look how close these are in orbital lineups to each other. Let's start back in the Maunder minimum. I put the lines on this so you could see it so much easier here. With Uranus and Jupiter in the lead pair in 1665, and then the second rotation 10 years after, we'll get the Uranus-Saturn lead on that. During the 1600s, there was a 25% loss of the global population, a starvation throughout Europe. Europe was heavily affected. Severe flooding, everything was just moist and wet. Blight, mold, killing off the crops. So if you want a forecast of where these countries will be affected most greatly in this upcoming solar minimum, starting in a couple of years from now, we just need to look back in history. So India, they are going to be pummeled. So will Europe. Crop losses, abnormally low temperatures, extreme wet conditions. Let's take a look into our second set here, second row. You can see these camel humps match up almost perfectly. So we're going to jump into 1845, where we have the lead pair again, Uranus and Jupiter. And then 10 years later, after the second cycle, you can see they still keep that very tight parallel pattern with Uranus and Saturn leading. This brings us to the famines, the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. This time Indonesia was affected, as well as China and India. So keep that in mind. You've heard India twice so far, and you've heard Europe mentioned so far twice out of these last two cooling events. Let's jump into our current upcoming cooling event. The exact parameter match will be in 2024, but it will be cold long before that. It will start getting cold around 2018-19. This is the second 10-year pass with Uranus and Saturn in the lead. Now we can take a look from the solar activity events and carbon-14 dating. We are going to come back into something like the Maunder minimum or the Dalton minimum. And you can take a look in Antarctic ice core drilling that the 1600 cooling and the 1800 cooling were the two coolest periods in the last 500 years. Now we are going to mimic one of those again and repeat it. So here's my question to you. Before I explain why the governments are going to lock you down and try to control this planet before it happens and they lose control. 25% of the world's population perished in the 1600s due to this event. 10% of the world population perished in the 1800s. So I will ask you, what percentage of our global population is going to die off from this event coming right now? Think about how our societies are very different than they were when people were much more self-sufficient. They did not have just-in-time delivery, and there were not million-plus population centers. There are cities that have 30 million people that have 3 days' worth of food. And back then as well, there were only 750 million people on the entire planet. Now there are 10 times as many at 7.5 billion. So you might want to really, look back in history and see what the differences are between our society now and their societies back then with the significant effects. Those people were hardy. They knew how to hunt. They could repair and prepare for anything. They had unlimited wood to burn, yet they froze to death in their homes. There was unlimited food. It was a veritable garden forest with innumerable animals, plants, vegetables, fruits to gather throughout the entire season. Yet they starved to death. Jumping back further in history, now I'm not a history major, but if any of you out there are history buffs or actually have studied, written about, or know about chapters of history, there's been a couple lineups that match up exactly with today's lineup. 79 AD with a 10-year pass at 89 AD. I mean, literally almost exactly like it is going to be today, just a couple of degrees different. So 1845 and this last pass here, 7989, are the closest that we can get to, literally just a couple of degrees off. Happened again 1st century BC. And if we go back to the 6th century BC, we get into that same orbital parallel pattern with Neptune and Jupiter leading on this time. And also I found something really interesting. It's just shortly after that 1st century, instead of Neptune leading with the first pair, Uranus started to lead with the first pair from that point forward over the last 2,000 years. Everywhere on this chart that you see a drop in temperature is when there was a lineup of the 4 gas giants ushering in a cold period on our Earth. Now let's take it a step further. This is the 3rd layer of cycles that are happening at the same time, going on to the cool trend. Jeff Scott did a really good job lining up the PDO sine wave with the strength intensity of the Landscheidt cycle, with the solar minimums, with the camel humps at the bottom. I added in the yellow boxes going forward so you could see each time the significant cooling occurred, we were heading downward. Both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were cooling during the cycle. This had significant atmospheric oscillation effects. That's why there was so much drought and rain everywhere. Now, if we're going to talk about surface oscillation of the oceans, I circled in yellow where we are going to be when this cooling event really kicks in around 2019 or so. Both of our oceans are going cool. You'll notice also in the 1600s, the bottom of that happened at the bottom of the cooling of the Atlantic and Pacific. This is on a 60-year cycle. You can just use some simple math. If you can divide by 600, then you can go back and figure this chart out yourself. Oscillations for ocean temperatures. 1800, same thing. 1300, same. 500 AD, this is a cooling. And again, I'll bring you back to the very bottom there, that 79 and 80 AD. Also cooling oceans and going into the solar minimum. So we are matching that same exact pattern. Atlantic multidecadal oscillation undulates on this 60-year cycle, easily discernible here. Also, the Pacific decadal oscillation undulates on this 60-year cycle. One of the most interesting things, though, global surface temperatures pretty much match the AMO. La Nina is going to be kicking in next year, which is going to have a little bit of lag time. You could expect some cooling in late 2017, but the most significant cooling will begin in 2018. A lot of questions will be asked at that point of our politicians why it's happening. And the scientific community like the IPCC, who's been sending us down the wrong road, illuminating the wrong path for some purpose. Again, the difference in ocean temperatures between El Nino and La Nina. This takes a single year to switch over from heating into cooling. And this is how we arrived at this ocean oscillation surface temperatures. Now, tree ring data, again, they can forecast out into the future about the growth of forests. This is interesting. They're showing a cooling trend as well. It's going to dip below into the cool. I find that we got 5 different layers of cycles showing us that it's going to cool. Now, this is the wild card here. All of the planets in our solar system are showing signs of global warming. Every one of them. This is an energetic event. We are going through a band of heightened electrical vibration, a Birkeland current that we're traveling through. All of the planets are showing signs of heating, warming, and significant vibrational frequency increases. Throw into this unusual noctilucent cloud. Headlines, next solar cycle could be a no-show. They're talking about the solar cycle being pushed off even 2 to 5 years. Now, what are the effects going to be of this? And this is truly why you're watching this video. What are the effects going to be? When we go back in time, each one of these events has also affected ocean surface temperatures. We can go to the Gulf of California, the sea temperatures off Mexico, the Nordic Sea. Every one of our oceans is affected temperature-wise in the northern hemisphere. What it resulted in was less fish. The fish fry have a more difficult time in cooler waters, as well as pelagic fish. There's a decrease in fish stocks during these events. Also, there's going to be a massive increase in icebergs throughout the northern hemisphere oceans. Those icebergs are going to be drifting so far south that it will interrupt shipping. When we talk about atmospheric oscillations, you're going to be looking for massive floods just like they did in the 1600s. It was so wet that they A, couldn't plant in time, and B, they couldn't harvest in time, and C, everything had so much blight and mold on it that they needed fungicides back then, which they didn't have, but we do have now. Now, how many fungicides will need to be sprayed to combat and equalize the effects of such a moist, moldy climate? And really, would you want to eat that? Currently, the UK, wettest in the last 250 years, which would make sense. We're looking at cycles going back 300 to 400 years on this. 2015, even wetter than that article, that was 2014. Flooding in the UK, snow on the roofs, floods on the ground. Also in the United States, these are the biggest floods in 300 years across the Mississippi area right now. In late December, early January, flooding across almost half of this basin of the largest river in the United States. Iran receives 5 months worth of rain in a single week. This massive warm air pushing up into the Arctic. 3, 4, 5 typhoons forming in the Pacific Basin at a single time. This exceptional heat wave that came through in late December, interestingly, matches exactly with La Nina temperature distributions, but it arrived a year before the La Nina actually kicks in. Now, I'll let you look at that again because so many people have written me and said, oh, it's so warm this year. Well, you know, it's expected to be warm across the southeast United States in the La Nina years, but this year is quite different. It arrives so early, and there's so many other signs across the planet that it's getting cooler. Coldest in 50 years in Finland, cities in Vermont, Maine, coldest February this last year, southern hemisphere ice extent growing, increases volcanically worldwide. I'll let you do a little more research of this on your own, but during these solar minimums, there's always increased volcanic activity. Now, Mount Laki blew up and we had a year without a summer in the 1600s. Indonesia, 1815, year without a summer. We can expect another major volcanic eruption over the next few years that'll send us into a year without a summer. And this brings me right into the global food supply, which is going to be affected. And the governments know this. And this is the scariest thing for a government. Hungry people do not care if you have a line of soldiers shooting at them. They are so hungry, they're going to die anyway from no food. So to fight the government forces to get food for them, they do things that normal people will not do. They will kill for their families. They will kill you for a loaf of bread to feed their children. You know, hungry people are completely unpredictable. A force that you cannot reckon with because they are so far beyond reason. World wheat production. This is my personal forecast here. So talking about the intensification from 2019 forward, you can expect some progressive crop losses up until 2024 when almost everything 45 North goes offline. Now, in a couple years prior to that, I'm using 1/3 as the crop loss. Actually, it could be higher, but I'm going to be very conservative and say 1/3 of the global wheat production will be lost in that time frame of 2021 and 2022. So if we have 726 million tons of wheat production and you take away almost 128 million tons, how will that drive price? What kind of food shortages will that create? What kind of problems will it create for stability for society? These are the areas where they predominantly grow wheat. Canada, that's going to be one of the first places to go offline. It's going to get exceptionally cold so fast up there. Mongolia, Heilongjiang in China, that's going to go offline. It's already suffering severe drought, and they lost production last year on corn and wheat both. So you could look back in history and see what happened to their collapse of dynasties and know for sure that they're going to lose their food growing area in the north. Also, the EU and Russia, going to lose a lot of production there. That was significantly both in the 1800s and the 1600s cooling events. They lost an enormous amount of crop production. And this is literally the largest place in the world where they produce our wheat. So if this goes to zero, then we already lost that full 128 million plus a little bit just from the EU. Now we're coming over to the rollover point anyway next year, where global production for wheat and the consumption are almost at an equal. So if we're going to remove 127 million tons from that, where does that take us on price? Also, corn is going to be affected, not as greatly because corn likes a little bit wetter conditions. It grows a little further south, but the very northern edges of the corn growing belt, if you will, like in Ontario and a few other places along the Great Lakes, going to see significant reductions. Governments are going to have to reduce and repeal these fuel laws that we have, where we have to mandate a certain percentage of ethanol into the tank. This is what's really caused a lot of food price rises in the last 5 to 7 years. Animal feed went up in price, which drove the price on all of the meats that you eat. Fuel prices, didn't really put a dent in those. It didn't really help us with the atmosphere too much. There's still so many developing countries polluting so much that all the food that we put into our fuel tanks, all it did was raise the price of our food, and it didn't really do anything to help the environment. Now already what's happening in South Africa and the southern African nations, they're in a severe drought right now. They're more than 4.5 million tons down on their crop production. Corn is affected, soybeans are affected, sunflower seeds are affected, sorghum. You know, if you're going to lose wheat, people are going to switch over to different crops. So they're going to be looking for millet, sorghum, amaranth, buckwheat, these types of things, but there'll be drive on price on those. So if there's not enough of that, somebody will switch over and start to go to rice. And then when there's not enough rice, the whole system locks up because they're no longer able to switch food supplies. Which brings me back to the 1830s again, right in our last time, just a couple years before that planetary alignment I showed you. The severe food shortages were in Germany and Japan. Notice that in the 1800s also China was greatly affected, so this proves that Japan was affected too, which brings us across that whole panhandle there of rice growing, wheat and corn, right through northern China, Korea, and Japan. It's a regional area that are going to be affected. So for sure, the EU is going to be incredibly affected, as well as Asia. Now, how are you going to control all these people? Hungry, starving, angry people. And Henry Kissinger sums it up best. If you can control the food, you can control a nation. If you control the energy, you control a region. If you control the money, you control the world. This gets back into the self-preservation and continuity of government. The governments of the world are going to try to hold out to keep power as long as they can, and after the ashes settle, reemerge and still try to retain control. This is not going to happen if chaos is just allowed to unfold on its own organically. V. the Guerrilla economist, in an interview with Greg Hunter, explains in such a way that everybody can understand the unfolding of chaos economically. And he also states that it seems like it's an organized, planned event versus just some random rattlings in the market. I would agree, as well as Gerald Celente talks about this chaos is being perpetrated by such sociopaths that it has to be happening on purpose. And there's so many disconnected pieces out there of why the global economic system's in such turmoil, and why nations around the planet are turning into police states, why there's so much surveillance of citizens, why there's so many bulk buys on ammunition and areas around the planet being turned into internment areas. It just doesn't make sense unless you know that all of these food shortages are coming. The bulk coffins, they got what? Enough coffins for 50 million people? That makes sense. And most startlingly, out of both of these videos that I watched, they come down to really show that there's 40 trillion in derivatives, that somehow in 2016 or 17, this is going to unwind. And what it does, it's going to be a purposeful unwind. So everything that happened in Cyprus and also in Greece was a test to see how the citizens would react. So what you saw in Cyprus and also in Greece, with the capital controls and the banks freezing assets, confiscating depositor funds, this is going to happen on a global level. Notice this shot here. Those people are middle class, nicely dressed, struggling for a few dollars out of an ATM machine. You will not be allowed to travel internationally as we do today, where you can just buy a ticket and get on a plane. If this were the case, when the cooling really starts, there will be 7 billion people trying to flee the area where they live to try to get to a warmer destination where the food will be available. Now, just the movement of the people would disrupt every economic system on the planet. You know, people are going to pull all their money out of the bank. They're going to quit their job. They're going to roll into a different place that already has a lot of people. It would be just global chaos relocating everybody. Let alone when all these people are hungry and starving. This is going to be off the hook, something that is going to rattle our society. It's going to be an actual destruction of everything in the society that you know currently. This is a reset button, and it's going to be controlled. So put yourself in the place of the leaders of our world today. They know this is coming. If I've done my own research, and I'm not a scientist, I'm an agricultural trader. I trade Arabica coffee beans from Myanmar. And the whole reason I ever got into this entire global cooling and solar effects was the coffee beans being grown in Myanmar suffered cold losses on the new plantings of up to 15% each year in the last 3 years. When we were doing our supply allocation forecasts going out for 5 years, we really couldn't guarantee that we had a supply for our customer based on the losses. Now, if you plant 100 acres and 15 of the acres die off and the other new plantings are damaged on the leaves due to cold, it takes an extra year or so for those plants actually to come on, and they don't have the yield either. They're damaged. The top layers of the adult plants or the mature plants, even the 7-year-old plants, the top layers of those leaves were damaged. The density of the beans has been decreased all the way across Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar. There was significant cold damage and effects on the plants, and I just had heard global warming my whole life. And here I am in an equatorial band country that is considered to be hot. Yet I'm looking at 3 years of cold losses, and then it hit me after I was doing all of the research. As a government, what would you do? I first would distract everybody. I would tell them it's warming. So if anybody says it's cooling, and I have enough momentum behind me as in a movement, and when you say it's cooling, they say, no, it's warming. I can't believe you say that. You're crazy. It's warming. I would also divide the people. I would put cultures that don't mix together as much as I could to see what happens. I would allow illegal immigration into countries so I could divide even further. So nobody would trust anybody. So when it comes down to it, when you need the help, nobody will help anybody. You'll be so divided. Additionally, I would disarm you. I would make sure I took away your guns. And then I would limit your movements even within your own countries. This is the plan for the United States. Agenda 21, biodiversity zones. After the population decreases, you will not be allowed into these areas that are red. Let's take a look here at the breakdown on it. Red is a no-go at all, 0 human use area. So when we take a look, specifically, let's go into California, western area there. Look how much of that is off limits for you. The yellow is severely restricted zones. The areas of blue and the purple are what are left for human habitation. As I look at this map, I say, wait a minute, there's 20 million people in California and a couple other millions spread around through the other states there. How can you squeeze all these people in such small areas? And I said, oh, well, if I reduce the population of this planet down to 500 million, I could squeeze everybody into those habitation zones right there. And that's if I'm thinking like a government would. But I'm thinking like an individual, like I want to survive through this. This is an absolute controlled demolition of our society, economy, way of life. So with the global famine on our doorstep, you can see how all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fit together now. 2018 is going to be the very first where the cooling happens, where it's going to start to open some eyes. Global warming will no longer have, shall we say, the teeth as it does as a religious type of fervor these days. The media is going to go into overkill. They are going to try to explain that the warming out of the evaporative losses of the ocean is causing so much cloud cover. That's the reason for the snowstorms. But in reality, it's going to be caused by the magnetosphere on our sun decreasing our Earth's magnetic shield. The magnetosphere allowing more cosmic rays in, which also increases the cloud cover. Both the end effect can be explained through whatever mechanism you decide. Same end result, two different explanations. 2019, once we get into that late spring arrival, you have about 6 months until the cold comes. You need to start thinking like these politicians and how these leaders of government think, because you are the ones they are trying to cull. And when I say cull, I mean get rid of you off this planet. And they're going to try to make as much profit off of your death as they can. So the winter begins in 2019 and the cold really hits at this point. Food prices are going to be 3, 4, 5, 10 times what you're paying now. The global economy is going to be in absolute shambles beyond the Great Depression levels. So you ask yourself, if you're not having the income coming in and your food price rises just even 5 times, what is the effect going to be? Well, I already know you're going to turn to crime and try to feed your families, so I already have a police state in place to arrest you, detain you, and take you away. 2020, the gas giants completely start lining up here, and the cooling gets intensively worse, like a degree drop, and spring doesn't arrive until June, and then the winter already starts again in September. First crop losses are coming. Reduced yield globally. Fields will be raided like they were in Thailand and across Southeast Asia in 2008 when rice fetched several $100s a ton. There will be armed guards guarding fields. This will be the kind of employment that will be offered to the starving masses. You'll have to become a security guard to guard the food supplies, much like they did in the 1600s when they had to guard every single grain delivery. 2022, yields are decreased even further. At this point, cities will have disbanded. You will not be able to live in a city. There'll be no more delivery mechanisms going in. There'll be food shortages. 2023, it's evident by these last couple of years. If it's not evident, even the people who are so asleep right now are going to wake up by 2023. And answers will be demanded of why this was allowed to occur without warning anybody. At this point, everybody that's in power disappears somewhere. Of their own volition, of course. They're hiding, basically, because their lives will be in danger from the angry mobs and masses. 2024, there will be significant losses of life globally. So by 2024, whoever's left will be the survivors through the event. You will have already adjusted your lifestyles enough to get through the next few years until 2034 or so. There's a real interesting astronomical alignment with Neptune and the Earth and the Sun, and then Jupiter, Earth, and Uranus on the exact day that does a sort of a cross like this. Pretty interesting lineup. 2034, after the second rotational pass, the 10-year norm pass on this, it will begin to warm up again. When it does warm up, there will be far less people on this planet. The economic system can start over again. You know, we're at the end of the credit bubble. We're at the end of easy credit. We're at the end of expansion. We're at the end of production and consumption. It's at the end of the cycle. Now keep in mind, please, that this is a very real event. The governments gave us no warning because by giving warning prior to the event, people would be fighting for shovels and bags of seeds and potting soil in the stores. Long before the event happened, people would quit their jobs. There would be very little economic activity. People would just be getting ready for this. You see how it is in the United States. In the first shopping days of the Christmas season, people are fist fighting over TVs and little toys. Imagine what it would be like when you're going to be fighting for your life, the necessities that you need to stay alive. They would kill each other in the stores for the last shovel. That's why you haven't been warned. The chaos would have been so great before the event. So the event is allowed to happen. It's going to unfold. There will be less loss of life this way, perhaps. We got different religions on the planet. We have different languages on the planet. We have different colored skin on this planet. But remember, we all belong to the single human race. And that's what these leaders of today's world want you to forget. They try to divide us so we won't help each other. We'll hurt each other. We will not come together to work with each other because we've been programmed not to artificially. This is not the way humans should be acting toward one another. You have a couple years left to prepare. This is an orchestrated event. Global collapse is coming. Societal collapse is coming. Population decimation is coming. You're going to have to get ready for this. But after watching this video, hopefully you're a little more prepared on what's going on. And this explains why all these chaotic events happening around the planet that seem to make no sense, now you can weave them together why they make total sense and why it's happening. And those of you in the IPCC, shame on you for not warning these people what's about to happen. You are sending them down the wrong direction. You are purposefully misleading and misguiding people on this global warming hoax. Now, thanks for watching the video. I am going to keep putting videos out for the next couple of years, following the trends. If I know this is coming, the governments with guys with PhDs know this is coming. John Casey has been warning the United States government about this downtrend in cooling for years. They know it's coming. They are planning for the collapse. And I think you should start to get ready as well. Talk to your neighbors. You're going to need to work together through this thing here. There's no surviving it on your own by hoarding food in your home. And this preparation is going to require mental, spiritual, and physical preparation. You are going to have to do things that you never thought possible. You're going to have to grow your own food. You're going to have to know basic medicine. You're going to have to know how to butcher your own animals and cure your own meat. You're going to have to learn self-defense. And I truly wish every single one of you the best luck in the preparation you can to work together. And when we come out of this thing in 2035 and I meet you somewhere, I want to break a loaf of bread with you that we have sustained agriculture again and the temperatures will warm and we will once again have plentiful food for the population that still exists on this planet. I would highly appreciate it if you can circulate this video through your social media. Try to spread this message. If you can repost it, retweet it, reshare it, any way that you can get this message out to people.